All right.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're coming to you live online from our Talmud Lunch and Learn that meets every Friday at the Torch Center here in Houston, Texas at 12 o'clock. Lunch is, of course, provided by our chef, Ed, and we're very grateful that you take care of it every single week. Thank you so much. We missed you last week. Just want to share with you an interesting thought and idea on this week's Parsha. The great Chafetz Chaim, we know, lived in the city of Radin. In the city of Radin, there was no Chilul Shabbat. There was no desecration of Shabbat in the entire 70 years that the Chafetz Chaim lived in Radin. And after World War I, when World War I broke out, the Chafetz Chaim needed to move with the people in his village. Later he moved back, but he needed to move, and the Chafetz Chaim, for the first time in his life, witnessed the desecration of Shabbat by other Jews. It was the first time he saw Jews desecrating Shabbat. And the Chafetz Chaim cried and cried and cried. The second Shabbat that the Chafetz Chaim was there, he cried when he saw the desecration, even more than the first time. So his students came to him and said, the first time, okay, it's been a shock to all of us. It's painful to see Shabbat being desecrated. But the second time, it wears off already. So why are you crying even more? So he says, you're right. The first time, it was total shock, and I cried for Shabbat. He said, the second time, I cried for myself. I cried that it hurt me less. We need to be spiritually sensitive. When we are in a culture, when we are in an environment where we have rampant immodesty, when we have rampant, you think of what's going on today in the news, what's going on every day in the news, it's a total craziness. In what way are we protecting ourselves to not become spiritually insensitive to the modesty, to the language, to the thoughts, to the things we see, to the things we hear? How are we going to ensure that we maintain a spiritual level of satisfaction that is satisfactory to our own standards, to God's standards? That's what we see in this week's Parsha. What we see in this week's Parsha is that Haroeh soteh b'kil kula, someone who sees a sotah, he sees a woman who has she's questioned by her husband whether or not she's been faithful. What's the immediate reaction? We go straight to the laws of the Nazarite. You stay away from wine. What brought this woman to this questionable situation? Was perhaps she was a little bit too loose, drinking out, doing things that may bring her to a situation like this. What's the immediate solution for us? Stay away from wine. When you see a car accident and you see that someone was hurt because they weren't wearing a seatbelt, what do? You immediately say, you know what? I have to be more careful. We need to see the things around us and be careful that we don't become, you think about it, right? Today, a certain individual who shall not be named, surrendered himself to the courts in Lower New York, in Lower Manhattan. Right? For what? For doing things that are inappropriate. When we hear these things, we become desensitized. Yeah, we say, man, terrible, terrible thing. And then you hear it 150 times, 200, 300. Well, that's life. And then we start justifying it. And we say, you know what? Maybe. And we start giving all these theories and ideas of how, whether it's justifications, God forbid, or whether it's, circumstances. This is what they sign up for. I've heard the most horrible justifications from people, or people saying, what do they expect? And, it's like, you know what? We're becoming desensitized from it. And we cannot allow ourselves to become spiritually desensitive to these things, spiritually insensitive. We have to make sure that whether or not we can limit what we hear, limit what we see, so that we don't fracture our spiritual capacities and our spiritual growth. Hashem should bless us all with an amazing Shabbos, and God willing, we should only be in an incline constantly in our spiritual pursuits, and we should elevate ourselves to become bigger and better spiritually and in every way possible. Have a wonderful Shabbos. Thank you for joining us, and let's continue with our Talmud.